Erin O'Toole's victory in the Conservative leadership race came on the third ballot last night. That's after he picked up supporters from the two candidates who had been eliminated in earlier rounds of voting. Let's break down O'Toole's path to victory and how the Conservatives might fare with him at the helm. To do that, we have reached a trio of number crunchers. The best in the business. Eric Grenier is the CBC's polls analyst. He's with us in Ottawa. Shachi Kurl is executive director of the Angus Reid Institute, and she's in Vancouver. And Christian Bourque is executive vice president with Leger. He's in Montreal. Hi to all three of you. Wonderful to see you.
Hello.
Hey guys.
Eric, let me start with you because I think it's helpful. You did a lot of on-the-go analysis last night, but I think it's helpful to refresh our memories about exactly how O'Toole was able to pull the win off and really how big a factor Leslyn Lewis and Derek Sloan's supporters ended up being for him, in particular, Miss Lewis.
Yeah, I think they were really what decided it for Erin O'Toole, because his score on that first ballot, somewhere around 31%, was more or less where people thought he might end up. But I think what the surprise was that Peter McKay was only at 33.5% of the points on that first ballot. We were all talking all night last night that he needed to hit at least 40% to have a shot at it. I don't think a lot of us were thinking he was going to get under 34%. So the fact that he was so close to Erin O'Toole put Erin O'Toole in a really strong position, because the combined support for Derek Sloan and Leslyn Lewis on that first ballot was 35%, and the vast majority of those votes, once Sloan dropped off and then Lewis dropped off, went to Erin O'Toole. Among those who ranked either McKay or O'Toole, among that Lewis and Sloan cohort of voters, almost by a margin of 4-1, they went to Erin O'Toole. So that was really what sealed it for him. And in the end, his victory, 57% to 43% over Peter McKay, is a pretty wide one. That's a big one. Last time it was only a 2-point gap. This time we're talking about a 14-point gap.
Christian, I saw you nodding there. When you saw those initial numbers in the first ballot, did you think Peter McKay was done? Like there was no chance he could pull it off after that?
Not necessarily no chance, but prior to this weekend, you're sort of looking at his capacity to raise money. And it was not that great. That everybody thought at the beginning that he would be able to outspend Erin O'Toole. And that's usually an indication of how he might fare on that first ballot. But that was not the case. So something was a bit, I wouldn't say fishy, but something was wrong in the sense that you did not get this feeling that he was coming in this with a ton of confidence. And the outcome yesterday also is an indication of that for Mr. McKay, it was not reaching the floor number that was a problem. He had a ceiling over his head, namely because of what everybody is thinking in terms of the two candidates that dropped off early. Their support came from voters who were not sort of longtime conservative card holders. They were sort of new people into the party that were voting on an agenda more than for a candidate. And probably there's no way they would be going to Mr. McKay at the end of the night.
Shachi, when you look at the outcome and the base of support that Mr. O'Toole was able to draw on, and in particular, people who voted for candidates who identified as social conservatives and then found a home for them in either their second or third place with Erin O'Toole, what are the implications, do you think, for O'Toole going forward?
Well, now the tennis match begins, right? Now the volley really truly begins between the Trudeau government and between Erin O'Toole and the Conservatives around playing for not just Conservative members. And I mean, I think as Christian and Eric pointed out, ultimately it was the hard work of Ms. Lewis, Mr. Sloan, Mr. O'Toole to really sign up enough members to dilute any gains that Peter McKay would have made in trying to get to first place. You know, Erin O'Toole, I keep wanting to call him Peter O'Toole. That's a different guy. Erin O'Toole did something pretty good yesterday, and I'll steal from Van Jones. He talked about Joe Biden's acceptance speech last week, and he said the speechwriter who wrote Biden's speech deserved a cookie and a hug and a flag and a puppy. Well, I would say the person who worked with Erin O'Toole on his speech last night at least deserves a hug and a cookie, because he moved very quickly to signpost some things, that he was there for urban voters, he was there for women, he didn't care about your sexual orientation or your gender assignment. Those were really key things to say immediately. Expect him to say them often. He's also trying to talk about and address the issues of Western alienation. That's Jason Kenney's influence in all of this. This is an issue that he talks a lot about. And so what you see is Erin O'Toole trying to move in two directions, one to shore up center or centrist voters, but also geographically trying to shore up Western voters as this upstart Wexit party starts to come onto the fore. And I was talking to Kathleen Petty on her excellent podcast about that last week. Nobody really expects at this stage Wexit to break through, but there may be some worries about just trying to protect your rear flank on that front. So he did a couple of things that were really important. At the same time, the Liberals have so much material to work with from his campaign run. The whole thing about taking Canada back from whom? Who are we taking it back from? So they have lots to work with too. But I will say just this very quickly. There are a lot of voters for whom the lingering aftertaste of Andrew Scheer really poisons the party against their consideration. Erin O'Toole is going to work very hard to cleanse that palate. And for the Liberals, they're going to have to work much harder and come to the table with more than "we're not Andrew Scheer." That's what they squeaked through with last time. They're going to have to do much more this time.
Let's talk a little bit in that vein, Eric, about the regional breakdowns, because you had some very interesting numbers that you just sent to our bureau. In particular, even though there's a weighted system, and so as a result, it didn't necessarily impact the results to the degree that it might in a different kind of system. The turnout, let's say in Ontario, in Alberta, and in Alberta, was far greater than it was in Quebec.
Yeah, absolutely. In Ontario, that's where the bulk of the votes came from. Well, almost half of the votes came from Ontario. Ontario is, of course, a big province. But Alberta was really where we saw tons of voters. The average number of voters in each riding in Alberta was almost 1,200. And if you compare that to Quebec, it was 98. Quebec had fewer voters than in Saskatchewan. If you take the 5 biggest ridings in Alberta in terms of the number of members who cast a ballot, those 5 ridings outweigh the 78 ridings in Quebec. But because of the way the voting system worked, those 78 ridings in Quebec had just as much weight as any other 78 ridings in the country. And so that's why we saw some odd numbers in the popular vote. If we look at the second ballot, Leslyn Lewis was actually first. She had the most of the popular vote on that second ballot, but because she was third in points, she dropped off. So, when we're talking about that social conservative vote, they had 35% of the points, but about 41% of the popular vote, just in terms of raw numbers. So clearly they're an important part of this party.
Christian, if I could get you to expand a bit on Quebec, because as Eric points out, it wasn't like there was a high turnout there, but Mr. O'Toole did score a pretty decisive victory in the province that ended up really factoring into his win.
Yeah, and I believe both Mr. McKay and Mr. O'Toole could have worked well with the province of Quebec moving forward with the electorate heading into the next election. Where I see Mr. O'Toole as having an advantage is the fact that if he's seen as being able to win Ontario, this is what will get a conservative leader support in Quebec, is that winnability factor. And so over the next few months is how is Ontario moving with Mr. O'Toole at the helm now. And this will give an indication to some Quebec voters who basically disappointed with Trudeau, went to the Bloc Québécois, but they're sort of parked there temporarily. Mr. Scheer was not palatable because of being sort of coined a social conservative, which will never work in Quebec. So I think if he's seen as gaining ground in Ontario, this will get people in Quebec to open their eyes to say maybe there's somebody that could replace the Liberals moving forward. So I think really it's Battleground Ontario now that becomes sort of the center of what is sort of the moving piece in this puzzle that might actually change the political landscape moving forward. Meanwhile, most people are still in this COVID business, still trusting the Trudeau government and what they've done so far. So getting people to focus on something else than wanting stability will be a tough battle ahead for the Conservative leader.
I have a feeling we'll be talking about it often if in fact there is an election as soon as this fall. We'll see, right? Thanks, guys. Appreciate your time and your insights this evening, as always. Eric Grenier, Shachi Kurl, and Christian Bourque.
You have given me a clear mission to unite our party, to champion our conservative principles, to show Canadians what we know so well, that Justin Trudeau and his team are failing our great country.
Welcome back to Power in Politics. Erin O'Toole was chosen as leader of the Conservative Party early this morning, outlining his mission, as you heard there, in his acceptance speech in Ottawa. But another part of that mission is going to be introducing himself to Canadians. He's been an MP since 2012 and a former cabinet minister, but a poll conducted a few days before the leadership vote found that 68% of Canadians don't know enough about O'Toole to form an opinion. So how might he go about introducing himself to Canadians? For more on that, I'm joined now by the Power Panel. Yolande James is a former Quebec Liberal cabinet minister. She's in Montreal. Brad Levine is the vice president of Council Public Affairs. He's over in Toronto. And Tim Powers is the vice chairman of Summa Strategies. He's with us right here in Ottawa. Hello, everyone. Great to see you.
Hello.
So I wanted to focus in on how other parties might be perceiving this, because I was anxiously last night trying to figure that out, and I found, actually, Yolande, I'll start with you, that before Erin O'Toole's speech there was one set of reactions, and after there actually was another. In that initially they were like kind of breathing a bit of a sigh of relief that it wasn't Peter McKay, and then all of a sudden after the speech they were like, oh, maybe this is more of a threat than we anticipated. How do you think? I'll start with the Liberals. How do you think they are perceiving O'Toole's win?
Well, I think for one, in any event, if you're smart, especially if you're in government, you should never underestimate any political adversary. So a little dose of fear is, I think, a good thing to keep you on your toes. So for one, I think we can say for Mr. O'Toole, for sure, the Conservatives have elected a leader that will, how can I put this, will be a lot more politically astute than Mr. Scheer. Yesterday's speech was another classic demonstration of that. So I think the Liberal Party will have to take that into account. On the other hand, it's not just a column of advantages. I mean, if you're the government today, you got to be looking as to how you are going to define Mr. O'Toole to the public, given that he's not known, given that he has made clearly, what I'd call some concessions to be able to win last night, to be able to seduce to a certain degree on the second ballot social conservatives. How is that going to play now that Mr. O'Toole has to now appeal to the electorate? Just for example, when you look at places like in Quebec, you could think, oh, this is great. He was #1 among members. But just think back to the last campaign, and Andrew Scheer at the beginning of after the leadership, he seemed to be going pretty well. But during the campaign, all issues with respect to abortion, someone kind of sunk him. So how will Mr. O'Toole deal with that? Those are issues I'm sure the government or the Liberal Party should be looking at.
What do you think the NDP should be looking at, Brad?
Well, I think for the New Democrats, and this has been going on for decades, but voters who support the New Democratic Party flee when the Conservatives are scary. When they're scary, they'll hold their nose and vote Liberal. Liberals dine out on this. You can see it already in their statement that they issued today, painting Erin O'Toole as this big, scary guy that we all need to coalesce behind the Liberal Party. So the NDP cannot feed into that Erin O'Toole is not scary, and he's not scary. I politely disagree with Yolande there. He got the social conservative vote, but that doesn't make him social conservative, nor did he have to broker any concessions in his platform to the social conservative movement. Social conservatives have always held a sway with electing leaders. They did so with Andrew Scheer in the last leadership, as well as provincially with Doug Ford. Social conservatives have a lot of power within the Conservative Party, but Erin O'Toole is not one of them. Ms. Lewis was one of them. Mr. Sloan was another. But I think it's very, very rich for the Liberals to call out that Mr. O'Toole is scary. He's a moderate red Tory, and it's actually kind of funny, Vash. If you take a look at what Mr. Bernier from the People's Party said, I think that he was saying he's just another red Tory. He is a red Tory. He's not going to be scary. He's out of touch with what Canadians need right now. But if he pivots back to the center, and this is an interesting leadership race where he, unlike his last run to become leader of the Conservative Party, he tacked to the right. If he tacks back to the center, people, I think Canadians will, New Democrat supporters won't fear any election of an Erin O'Toole, and they'll feel comfortable staying with Mr. Singh and the NDP.
Let me challenge a bit of that with Tim, and I think what Yolande was getting at was whether we and pundits in the media want to classify him as a red Tory. During the campaign, Erin O'Toole, primarily talked about taking Canada back and how he's a true blue conservative, and in fact staked so much of his campaign on division that he wanted to characterize between himself and Peter McKay as a quote-unquote liberal light. To the question of social conservatives, Tim, what's your view? And then also, what's the long view on the electorate and sort of the appeal or the potential appeal during a campaign?
Well, if you want to get into typology and just get right down to those conservative weeds, Erin would be more described as an Ontario Tory and not a red Tory, morphed into a blue Tory. He's a super Tory, I guess, with all the titles that have been affixed to him today. Look, I think what this conversation has shown is the challenge and opportunity Erin has. He has got to manage all the different elements of the coalition that he creates. And I think that's the key point. Stephen Harper created one coalition. Andrew Scheer didn't really alter that coalition. But Erin O'Toole signaled last night, and again, you saw a bit of a transformation. You had angry Erin during the leadership campaign, and you had the affable, warm Erin that many of us have known and come to like here in Ottawa. But he's going to have to find a way to bring all of those coalitions together while he gets picked at, as Brad rightly alluded to, on different sides. The Liberals today, unsurprisingly, I'm sure, to Mr. O'Toole and to them, came out and began the Stephen Harper portrait. Mr. Singh was a bit more respectful, I think, in his language, saying he hoped people would work together. So the longer the opposition to Mr. O'Toole doesn't define him, the greater the opportunity for him. So he's soon going to have to seize on who is the Erin O'Toole I want to present to Canadians consistently.
And Yolande, on that point, it could be incredibly soon, right? Like, we face the possibility in 5 weeks that the throne speech faces a confidence vote and doesn't work out for the government. I know that that's at this point in time, at least, fairly unlikely scenario, but it is possible. So on Tim's point of sort of the ideas that Erin has to put forward, that Mr. O'Toole has to put forward, the image, whatever it be, the cohesive nature of it, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that certainly has to be among his top priorities. I mean, I just think in terms of, it was some time ago, Quebec election, where in 1998, Lucien Bouchard was able to win over Jean Charest. That was a newly elected member of the Liberal Party, because he called the election really quickly and didn't give him the time to pretty much align himself as the credible alternative. So for sure, that has to be among Mr. O'Toole's concerns. But just to maybe circle back to what Brad was saying, I believe it was Brad, just to compare again to the two Erin O'Tooles that we saw in the first leadership campaign that he ran in versus this one, where he did seem to present himself as being more center or right of center, but he understood to win as he did last night, and congratulations to him for that he had to pivot right definitively. I remember his very first campaign announcement was kind of, wow, okay, who is this guy? This is not the guy I remember from the last time. So that doesn't just erase itself or disappear because there is an election. You do have to find ways to be able to reconcile what your base is asking you and what the electorate at large is requesting of you. And I think of places like here in Quebec, where the issues that social conservatives do put forward are fundamental. How is he going to face those head on? That question is unanswered.
He's got to be thinking about it, Brad, just based on what Mr. O'Toole said in the speech last night. The fact that, and he almost took a page out of Justin Trudeau's book as I was listening to him deliver that speech around reaching out to people who wouldn't conventionally vote for the Conservatives. He named, people, for example, who are in unions, who normally wouldn't look to the Conservatives, and ask them to take a second look. It's got to be more than just a speech, though. What kinds of things does Erin O'Toole actually have to do, Brad, in order to make that become reality?
Yeah, I think the first thing is he needs to decide whether or not he wants to aid and abet an election right away this fall, as you were describing. I'm firmly on the camp that I think that, especially for the NDP, this is an opportunity to do great things in Parliament and not have an election. But if Mr. O'Toole wants to have an election, then he's got one. It has to, everyone has to be in on it. This Parliament is only 10 months old. The mandate hasn't even finished its first full year. So the drums for a federal election, I think, are far too premature. Second thing I would say is when Parliament does come back later in September, not to spend much time in Parliament. I said this to Jagmeet Singh. I've said this to Tom Mulcair. While it may be, if you have a brand challenge, that is, not enough Canadians know you, being in Parliament, while I know it's part of your job as an MP, and that job should be done, but every spare moment should be spent out in the hustings, meeting people and developing that brand that you want to do. There are no votes on Parliament Hill. The votes are out among the people. Leave the team, leave the front bench to do its work and hold the government to account, which is the official opposition's main duty. But get out there and do that. It's very interesting what you're saying, Vashi, about him wanting to broaden the coalition. There's no question that the Conservative, that the bandwidth there is tight. That is, those that consider voting Conservative, much of them do. But that doesn't win you elections. That is not what he must expand that base. And his appeal to blue-collar workers is a page out of Doug Ford's book. It worked for Doug Ford in the last election, who just eked out a victory over Andrea Horwath and has been fighting for those non-traditional Conservative votes to stay within the coalition ever since. So it's probably a smart play that others should take note of.
That's actually a great point, and I think even of last week, Doug Ford was talking about that coalition. I think he was asked a question about maybe the federal party, and I remember him very distinctly saying, Tim, I'm not trying to rid himself of those typical assessments of who votes Conservative, and he was explicit about it. And he was framing it in the pandemic and about governing and saying, I'm not just here to help Conservative voters. I'm also helping these people and these people. But it is, like Brad says, very much a strategy that he employed during the last campaign that might have to somehow rear its head this time around too.
Yeah, look, Brad was talking about accessible voters too, and that's part and parcel of it. How do you identify with people and on what ground? O'Toole used part of his family story to try and do that last night, talking about teachers and healthcare workers. Again, not necessarily the allies one would think of federal Conservatives. The Conservatives, and I think the poll you were citing was our Abacus one earlier that was talking about how well known he was or wasn't in this case. That same poll talked about the accessible voter pool. The Conservatives right now have the lowest accessible voter pool. Part of what Erin O'Toole has to do is drive that pool up. But it's all going to start tomorrow for him anyway, Vashi. Not to channel Andrew Scheer here, but when your colleagues start lobbing hand grenades at him at about 11 o'clock in the morning, he's going to get asked some questions about where he stands on same-sex marriage, where would he reopen the abortion debate, and he's prepared, I'm quite sure, for all of that. He's seen how they've not been well answered by Andrew Scheer and others. So, the introduction was supposed to start last night, but it really starts tomorrow. He's going to want to come off well on that, and I'll be looking to see how he answers questions on climate change and how he finds accommodation with the West. Because the one issue we haven't talked about yet, and they're not represented on this panel, I certainly don't represent them, nor do Yolande and Brad, but Western separation is real. That was part of his conversation, I gather, with the Prime Minister today. Arguably, the biggest threat to the success of Erin O'Toole is in the West, because if Wexit wins 10 or 11 seats, is able to mount a campaign, that makes what he does in other parts of the country much more difficult. So he's got to navigate all of that as well, too. An unknown party, a known party that has no seats, that is a real threat. How does he fight that battle?
And that, Yolande, speaks to Brad's point about not spending the entirety of your time in Parliament. That's something James Moore said a bit earlier in the show. And just to Tim's point quickly, a programming note, we do have a panel coming up with Western representation to talk about just just those issues. But Yolande, on the issue of sort of not spending your time in Parliament, of making sure you're out there, that speaks to what both Brad and Tim and what Tim just outlined around having to build some bridges where there are some threats.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, we'll agree 100%, the three of us, on that point. And in no way do I want that to be some kind of discrediting the role of Parliament. I don't think any of us want to do that. But the reality is, for the Conservative Party, for our parties now, it's a minority government. Yes, I know it's only been 10 months, but the possibility of an election is there, given what the Bloc has said, for example, and others. So that being said, he's got to be able to quickly be on the ground, to be able to get his notoriety up and present his case as to why he is a credible alternative to the government. And that will not be done in Parliament. I just think if that was the case, Brad would agree. I think Tom Mulcair would today maybe be Prime Minister of Canada. So I think we should expect that Mr. O'Toole will learn from that and will more so be traveling around the country to be able to connect with voters.
Quick final word. I want to ask both you, Brad and Tim, about what we can expect. Tim mentioned that tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock Eastern, Erin O'Toole will hold his first press conference. We're anticipating that he might make some announcements around appointments. Who do you keep closest in the fold, Brad, if you're Erin O'Toole?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would make sure that those that he ran against that are worthy of keeping around. I think Ms. Lewis should have a role in some capacity. I know that she's not a sitting MP, nor is Peter McKay. I don't know what he wants to do with Mr. Sloan, who is a sitting MP, came in dead last, very aggressively social conservative. But in terms of I think it all comes down to keeping the caucus united. It's been done, by leaders very well in the past. Some have done a very poor job of it. But, I think, and I know that other pundits on the channel today and yesterday night have said it. Caucus unity is number one priority for Mr. O'Toole, particularly in the early days. You don't get a second chance. So for the critic portfolios, keep making sure that he's got the representation from across the country in key roles. It'll be interesting to see what from folks that Mr. Scheer didn't, tag for good posts or important posts. It'll be interesting to see who he brings out. Who will be his deputy. All those kinds of things. You only get the first, one chance to make that first impression, and caucus unity should be first and foremost in his mind today as he puts together that list of assignments.
Tim, last word to you.
Yeah, I mean, don't batten down the hatches. Keep the door open. I think one of the things Mr. Scheer suffered from was a degree of paranoia, a very tight circle. Mr. O'Toole has a bigger network. He knows people all across the country. He needs to listen and engage and take his time, but not too much time, to develop a narrative and a plan that he's happy with, because Conservatives won't win, as he said himself, unless they have something more than Justin Trudeau as a dastardly fellow, and that is all they need to win. It's not. They need a plan.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks, guys. Appreciate your time and your insights, as always. Yolande James, Brad Levine, and Tim Powers.